Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to a quick look at the first realignment in American history. And you're going to say, why are we in 1820 rather than 1824? I decided to look at this realignment. I didn't want to do a map because realignments are always quirky. I may change that for the future. But we need to start by looking at where it came about. So 1820 and 1824 are really the last two elections of the first party system. Some will say that 1824 shouldn't be counted, some will count it. It just depends. Personally, I'm using it as the last election of the first party system because we still had the Democratic-Republican Party in existence at that time. So I think it's fair to do so. Now, why am I saying that the realignment didn't happen in 1824? I mean, it did, but what I'm saying is it took more cycles. Well, the simple answer is it takes time for issues to shift as dramatically as they did. And it also takes time for different coalitions to form around those policy ideas. Some of them did remain the same, but certain issues rose to prominence in the aftermath of the first party system. So the first thing we need to talk about, or the first thing we need to cover, is that the Democratic-Republican Party was the only party by 1824, and it was not very well organized at all. And there were a lot of coalitions within the party. You had John Quincy Adams representing former Federalists. You had Andrew Jackson sort of carrying on the torch of the true Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, right? William Crawford and Henry Clay were kind of these new Western candidates, and Crawford being a Southern candidate was very much in the spirit of the old Jeffersonians, Clay being a Western candidate, Jackson being a Western candidate. The difference is that Jackson was able to steal the thunder of both Crawford and Clay in both of his respective in both the South and the West. And Jackson was able to do well in rural areas, and he was able to do well in the former swing states of the first party system, namely Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware. Now, of course, this is arising out of the era of good feelings. Again, the one party, just having one party. And unlike a lot of one party nations, the era of good feelings was not marked by a single-minded march towards the ideals of the people in charge of that party. This election proves just how split the Democratic Republicans were. And the whole reason the first party system ended was because Andrew Jackson felt like he was screwed out of winning the election. Because if you actually look at the numbers, he had a plurality of the popular vote, 10% greater than the second highest popular vote total. And he carried more electoral college votes and more states. The problem was that John Quincy Adams was better connected, and Andrew Jackson was not seen as a politician. He was seen as a loose cannon. In fact, Jackson is very similar to a certain president today. And I'm not necessarily bringing up the whole Jackson hated Native Americans or was, not a big fan, was a fan of slavery, stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. Jackson was brash. He was not what people expected from a presidential candidate, or eventually, when he did become president, a president. He was single-minded. It was his way or the highway. He was popular in his own right before he even became a politician. And in general, he didn't take no for an answer. And when he lost in 1824, he said the election was rigged. There was a corrupt bargain in the House of Representatives. And so he ran again in 1828, or more accurately, he ran the second the House declared Quincy Adams the winner. And quickly, they formed the Quincy Adams formed what's known as the National Republican Party, and Jackson called his party the Democratic Party because they focused on a popular mandate from the people themselves. And they wanted to extend voting rights to all citizens. Again, at this time, a citizen was a property-owning white male. I think he even wanted to extend it to non-property owning people, but they still had to be white and they still had to have a Y chromosome. Quincy Adams was representing the old Federalist positions to a degree. He was not as pro-Britain as, say, his dad was, or most Federalists. But Quincy Adams represented higher tariffs, better business, or more free, less business regulation, stuff like that. Stuff that would please the importers in the New England states, and the port cities, and policies that would benefit manufacturing, as we were starting to undergo the Industrial Revolution at this time. Slowly but surely. And that's what Quincy Adams and the National Republicans wanted, was they wanted more industry. Jackson was not a fan of tariffs. He wanted looser trade regulations. And he also was very much against the National Bank, and Quincy Adams represented the second bank of the United States. And of course, Jackson represented Western interests, but at this time he started also getting discussion about westward expansion, whether or not we're going to start incorporating these new territories as states, whether we're going to try and make a push to make the nation grow all the way to the Pacific Ocean, from sea to shining sea, and what to do about that. Slavery was also becoming an issue, thanks to the Missouri Compromise in 1820, in which Maine was admitted as a free state in a compromise to allow Missouri to enter as a slave state, with any state below a certain line, later known as the Missouri Compromise line. Any state admitted that was entirely or mostly below that line would be admitted as a slave state. Any state that was entirely or majority above that line would be admitted as a free state. this was also becoming a bit of an issue, whether or not to expand and whether or not to continue the Missouri Compromise, and whether to expand slavery, if at all. And so you started seeing a bit more of a regional divide between North and South, but at this time, it was New England versus everyone else, minus a few mid-Atlantic states. By 1832, the opposition to Jackson was pretty fragmented. The National Republicans still ran a candidate in Henry Clay, and he performed extremely poorly. And South Carolina still continued to do its own thing by nominating somebody who was a huge fan of nullification, which was an issue early in Jackson's presidency. And then there was also a party called the Anti-Masonic Party, which that's kind of cool. They were the conspiracy theorists of their day. But you look at the issues, and the National Bank is still popular or not popular, but the National Bank is one of the major issues of the day. The debt is a major issue of the day. Jackson prided himself on two things during his presidency: paying off the national debt and killing the National Bank. And at this point, you would be forgiven for thinking that things are basically over and that Jackson's Democratic Party would dominate. And to a degree, that's what happened. And this is really the end of the first realignment, is you have a Democratic Party that favors lower tariffs, more trade, and a less intrusive national government when it comes to economic issues. They favor westward expansion and the expansion of slavery westward. And you have a bunch of anti-Jackson splinter groups that have no real alignment other than the fact that they hate Andrew Jackson and anything he created. So there were anti-Jackson groups that supported a national bank. Those would be in New England. Then you had anti-Jackson groups that aligned with him on policy but hated Jackson himself because they thought he ruled with an iron fist and was basically a king. Those would be located in the South and potentially even the West. Then you had anti-Jackson groups that were weird on policy and just, when I say weird on policy, they didn't really have policy goals. They just hated Jackson. Those would be located everywhere. And what we see is the second party system is defined by whether or not you liked Andrew Jackson and whether or not you thought he was a good president or whether or not you thought he was. But it took a while to get here. It took a few cycles to get here, and the way you got there was that you had a party that was split because it was the only political party. So you had members of one of the dead parties within your party, and they didn't agree with you. So that causes enough of a split that we have 4 candidates run. One does get screwed out of winning the election, and so runs again with his only goal being to crush his opponent, which he does. And because his base is not the educated and elites, the educated and elites get panicky, and moderate people think that they're just unwashed, uncouth. They're a mob, and they're afraid of mob rule. And you wind up having a party that is defined based off of whether or not you like this person. Again, it's very scary how similar this period is to the modern era in terms of what the parties are becoming defined upon. Anyway, next Friday we're going to take a look at the second party system and talk about whether or not it's a good thing to be against the incumbent party and nothing else. Anyway, take it easy. Have a nice day. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.